Good morning. My name is Hamdan Marar and I'm a diplomat in training at the Emirates Diplomatic Academy. I'm honored to welcome His Excellency Jeffrey Feltman, who served for 6 years as the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs under both Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Secretary General Antonio Guterres. During his period at the United Nations, His Excellency was the chairperson for the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Implementation Task Force and the Executive Director for the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Center. His Excellency was also a United States Foreign Service officer for over 25 years, focusing largely on the MENA region. He is currently a visiting fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation. Welcome to Emirates Diplomatic Academy, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor for me to be back at the Academy and to be able to have this exchange with you and to see so many talented future diplomats of the UAE.
Thank you. And if you may, I'd like to ask you a few questions. The first question is, why does diplomacy matter and why do we still need diplomats?
I think diplomacy matters more now than it has in my entire lifetime. I came to age in the Cold War. The Cold War was a split, a polarized world with the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies going after each other in various diplomatic means. You didn't need that much creative diplomacy because you just needed to know which of these two major countries you're going to follow. At the end of the Cold War, it was more or less a unipolar world for 15, 20 years where the United States sort of dominated the discussion. It was sort of an era of cooperation in places like the United Nations. Again, diplomacy wasn't as important as it is now. Right now, we are in a very complicated situation. Not only do we have great power politics between, say, China and the U.S. or Russia and their U.S., we also have a lot of regional powers that expect to be exercising their own influence in their respective regions in this very complicated world, not the dual polarized world of the Cold War, not the era of cooperation at the end of the Cold War. It's even more important for diplomacy to create ways to de-escalate conflicts, potential conflicts, create off-ramps for problems. It's more important now than ever.
Your Excellency, to adapt to these great challenges, what are the most significant ways that tomorrow's diplomats need to differ from today's diplomats?
You know, when I was growing up professionally in the U.S. Foreign Service, one thing that was important for us to understand were economics, because much of the relationships between nations were based on economic interests. So even those of us who were not economists had to have a basic understanding of economic concepts to be able to understand the nature of relations between states. I think now it's going to be really important for diplomats going forward to understand emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, things like that. Not to become necessarily experts, but to be able to understand the concepts enough to oversee negotiations, to oversee the creation of governance, political oversight for emerging technologies, artificial intelligence. If you look at our world today, commerce, infrastructure, intellectual property, communications, our own privacy, all depend on tools that are vulnerable to cyber attacks. It's easier for many different players to launch cyber attacks than it would have been for people to launch nuclear attacks, during the Cold War. The cost of entry is higher. So I think in the future, diplomats, starting now, diplomats are going to have a confidence in talking about the types of vulnerabilities faced to their country, faced to the international system by emerging technologies. Because we're going to have to create the governance systems, the political oversight to deal with what is a whole new category of potential risks. Emerging technologies are great in terms of enhancing wealth, in terms of trying to help bring people out of poverty, building economic growth, but they pose real risks, and diplomats from now going forward need to understand, in a way that I didn't have to, how they work so that you can start addressing the risks that they create.
And Your Excellency, to address these risks, what are the three most important characteristics or skills that these diplomats would need, and which ones are the most commonly lacking?
In terms of the skills, I don't think the skills have changed that much from the time that I entered diplomacy, several decades ago. Even if the goals are different, as I said now, to think about how you can talk about emerging technologies, how to govern emerging technologies. First of all, it's listening. You really need to understand what the issues, the perspectives, the policies are of the people you're meeting with. So listening remains a key ingredient of successful diplomacy. Related to that, I would add empathy. Even if you don't agree with some countries, some diplomats' policies or perspectives, you need to be displaying an understanding of how they came to that position. Again, in order for them to keep explaining to you why they're there, because that takes you to the third thing. After you've listened to them, after you've used empathy to draw them out on why they're expressing certain views, the third skill is communication. That you're able to use what you've listened to, you're able to use the fact that you've drawn them out more to understand their thinking more, to then go in and explain your country's policies, your own perspectives, in a way that they then can listen to because you've understood where they're coming from. And the communication skills are both oral and written. In terms of oral communication, it is dealing with your interlocutors, having listened to them, having understood what their concerns are, to be able to then take your policies, your government's policies, and put them into a context that they can be more receptive to understanding and more receptive to, you hope, accepting, meaning that you hope you have more influence on them. But the written communications are back to your capital. Mm-hmm. To be able to explain back in your case to Abu Dhabi what it is you've heard, why it is that this country, these diplomats have the perspective that they do, it then helps your capital develop its own response to whatever the issue is that you're working on. So ability to listen, to really listen, ability to sort of empathize, to understand the perspective that your interlocutor has, and then to communicate both back to your interlocutor, back to the capital. Those are the three skills I would put at the top of the list of what diplomats need, and it's the same as even old diplomats of my generation. We needed it too. In terms of sort of what's often lacking, I would say it varies. It varies from individual to individual, but you need to have an understanding that foreign policy and foreign relations are related but different. That when you're representing your country overseas, your goal obviously is to project the foreign policy of your country, but it's also to develop foreign relations that you can then draw upon. One would hope constructively later, but that when you're overseas, your goal is not necessarily to develop foreign policy. That's happening back at home. Your develop is to develop the foreign relations on which to project those foreign policies. When you're in the capital, when you're working at home, then it's to take the foreign relations and the perspectives that everyone has gathered from the embassies overseas to put them into the foreign policy context. But make sure that you understand that there's a distinction, even though they're related, between foreign policy and foreign relations. The reason why? Because if you are overseas and you only stick rigidly to your foreign policy and just repeat talking points from capitals, you're not going to develop the foreign relations that you can then draw upon later.
I see. And Your Excellency, what would be your one key message to the diplomats, such as myself, starting out their diplomatic career?
I mean, first of all, congratulations. I mean, it's an exciting career. I mean, I would not have changed my career at all. And I've seen Emirati diplomats throughout my career, and you have a really talented diplomatic corps, and I salute all of you for joining it. But be realistic and be patient. There are very few diplomatic breakthroughs that happen like that. That diplomatic breakthroughs take often years of preparation, years of patient relationship building, and it's simply not realistic to think that major accomplishments are going to happen at once, or even happen in one step. So I would take a patient and realistic view, step by step to try to make progress on the issues that you're working on.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'd like to ask you, For you had a long period at the United States Foreign Service and a great period at the United Nations. And what would you give us as an example of successful diplomacy and what made it so effective?
Yeah, I think that there are several. One could cite several examples, and I'll touch briefly on one and go into more detail on another. A brief one is I'll cite the Emirates. The United Arab Emirates was very effective in building up the momentum by which the IRENA, the International Renewable Energies Association, was based here in Abu Dhabi, and the UAE had was up against Germany. Germany had hosted the initial meetings that led to the creation of IRENA, and Germany, I would say, was the leading candidate. The UAE, through its effective diplomacy, by drawing on foreign relations, by coming up with certain ways to address potential member states' concerns, was able to get the IRENA headquarters here. I think that that's a success of UAE diplomacy, and it's an example of the type of negotiations that can lead to implementation of a foreign policy objective, which is to have a multinational organization based in the UAE.
And the last thing I'd like to ask you, Your Excellency previously stated in a video on YouTube concerning multilateralism, and it's in a retreat. How does that manifest itself inside the United Nations?
I mean, we've seen skepticism growing about the international order that we've all inherited. That was largely put together at the end of World War II. The United Nations is 75 years old this year, and people wondering, are these organizations still fit for purpose? And it's easy to find the areas where the tools that we've developed over the decades, aren't really adjusting to the strategic threat as it's evolved today. There's one that I mentioned when we had the occasion to talk to the students at the Academy. There's one that I mentioned where between 2013 and 2017, only 7% of battle-related deaths took places in countries where there were peacekeeping operations. So there's lots of reasons for us to think about how the multilateral system needs to evolve to fit today's strategic threat landscape. In the end, I think the UN Charter is almost a miraculous document, and I would be reluctant to see it set aside in favor of trying to recreate something, because I don't think we would come up with something that balances the desire for peace and the need for national security in the same way that the Charter does, or that creates some privileges, let's say, some privileges for great powers that induce the great powers to stay involved, while also giving a voice to other states that have the reasonable expectation to be able to exercise influence in the organization. So I think that the goal should be to preserve what we can, to maintain accepted channels of collaboration and cooperation where we can find common ground. But it's not always going to be the UN. It's not always going to be the organizations that we have. Preserve those for the collaboration when we can, but also find innovative new structures to build coalitions for other issues where the UN hasn't proven able yet to respond. And I go back to what I said earlier, the emerging technologies. I simply do not believe that we're going to be able to develop universal conventions on some of these emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, lethal armed weapons, things like that. Initially, there's too many divisions in the world, but we can start to build coalitions of like-minded states to establish standards that we then hope can be accepted by a broader number and perhaps eventually brought to the UN. So rather than starting at the UN on some of these new issues on emerging technologies, I would start with coalitions that you then expand and then endorse through the legitimacy that the UN offers.
I see, that's great information. And Your Excellency, thank you very much for sharing your time and insight with us, and it was a great pleasure and honor speaking with you.
Best wishes to you and your fellow students for successful diplomatic career.
Thank you very much. We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.